Smile for the cameras, Eleanor, my daughter-in-law whispered as she adjusted the pearl bracelet on her wrist. After all, none of this would exist without your money. I looked at her for a long moment while the crystal chandeliers above us reflected soft golden light across the ballroom ceiling. Then I smiled back as if her words hadn't cut straight through me. But something inside me changed forever in that exact moment. I'm Eleanor Whitmore, and at 68 years old, I thought I understood humiliation. I thought I understood loneliness. After losing my husband Richard 3 years ago, I'd learned how silent a 20-room house could feel at night. I'd learned how grief could sit beside you at the breakfast table like an invisible guest. But nothing prepared me for standing in the middle of my granddaughter's wedding reception and realizing my own family no longer saw me as a person. To them, I was simply a bank account with silver hair. The ballroom at the Fairmont Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago looked like something from an old Hollywood movie. White roses covered every table. Tall candles flickered beside crystal glasses. A string quartet played near the marble staircase, while waiters carried trays of champagne beneath towering floral arrangements that probably cost more than my first car. Sophie had always dreamed of a luxury wedding. And because she was my granddaughter, because I loved her more than life itself, I made sure she had one. I paid for the ballroom, the catering, the custom designer gown shipped from New York, the honeymoon suite overlooking Lake Como in Italy, even the 6-tier wedding cake decorated with edible gold leaf. I never minded spending the money. Richard and I built our fortune carefully over 40 years. He used to say that money only mattered if it made life gentler for the people you loved. I believe that too. At least I used to. Earlier that afternoon, I arrived at the hotel wearing a pale blue silk dress Richard always loved on me. I spent nearly an hour getting ready alone in my bedroom, carefully curling my silver hair and fastening the diamond earrings he gave me on our 40th anniversary. I remember standing in front of my mirror before leaving the house and thinking how proud Richard would have been to see Sophie getting married. For a moment, I even felt happy. Truly happy. That feeling lasted until I reached the reception check-in table. A young event assistant smiled brightly as she handed me my seating card and guest badge. "Welcome, Mrs. Whitmore," she chirped politely. I thanked her and glanced down at the elegant white card in my hand. Then my entire body went cold. Printed in delicate gold script beneath my name were the words, "The old woman funding this entire wedding." At first, I honestly believed it had to be some kind of mistake. I stared at the badge while noise from the ballroom faded into a dull hum around me. My fingers tightened against the cardstock. The girl behind the table noticed my expression immediately. "Oh my goodness," she whispered nervously. "I'm so sorry. Was there a printing issue?" Before I could answer, I heard laughter nearby. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, stood beside the champagne tower wearing a fitted emerald green gown with diamonds glittering around her throat. She held a champagne flute in one manicured hand while whispering something to 2 women standing beside her. All 3 glanced toward me and smirked. That was the moment I realized the badge wasn't an accident. Vanessa designed it that way on purpose. I felt heat rise into my cheeks, but I refused to let myself cry. Not there. Not in front of hundreds of guests. Instead, I pinned the badge onto my dress with steady hands and walked into the ballroom as if nothing was wrong. The marble floors clicked softly beneath my heels while conversations swirled around me. Laughter, music, silverware against china. Every sound suddenly felt sharp and distant at the same time. I noticed people reading my badge as I passed them. Some looked embarrassed, others amused. One older man near the bar actually chuckled under his breath before looking away. I smiled politely at everyone because that's what women from my generation learned to do. We smile. We survive. We keep our dignity even when someone is trying to strip it away piece by piece. I found my assigned seat near the front of the ballroom beside Daniel's business partners and their wives. My son barely acknowledged me when I sat down. He gave me a distracted kiss on the cheek before checking his phone again. Daniel used to call me every Sunday after church just to hear my voice. After Vanessa entered his life 12 years ago, those calls slowly disappeared. So did holidays, family dinners, birthday visits. Vanessa always had reasons. Sophie's dance lessons, business trips, scheduling conflicts. For years, I convinced myself none of it was intentional. I told myself families changed as children grew older. But sitting there beneath the ballroom lights with that humiliating badge pinned to my chest, I finally saw the truth clearly. Vanessa hadn't slowly separated me from my family by accident. She'd been doing it deliberately for years. Mother of the groom should be sitting closer. One woman at the table said awkwardly while glancing at my badge. Another gave a tight smile. Well, I suppose it's all in good fun. Fun. I folded my napkin carefully onto my lap and took a sip of water because I suddenly didn't trust myself to speak. Across the room, Sophie danced with her new husband beneath soft golden lights, while photographers captured every smiling moment. She looked beautiful, young, happy, completely unaware of what her mother had done to me. Or perhaps she knew. That possibility hurt even more. A waiter appeared beside me carrying a tray of champagne. I accepted a glass and stared at the bubbles rising slowly to the surface. Then I heard Vanessa's voice again floating across the ballroom. Honestly, if Eleanor stopped paying for everyone, she wouldn't know how to keep this family together. More laughter followed. Quiet, cruel, casual. I lowered my champagne glass slowly onto the tablecloth and looked around the ballroom one more time. The roses, the candles, the string quartet, the people smiling beneath crystal chandeliers while pretending humiliation was humor. And suddenly, for the first time in years, I stopped feeling sad. What replaced that sadness was something far colder. Because sitting there with that badge pinned to my chest, I finally realized something my family had forgotten. The money funding their entire lives still belonged to me. The wedding reception continued around me as if nothing had happened. Crystal glasses clinked together. Soft piano music drifted through the ballroom. Guests laughed beneath the warm glow of chandeliers while waiters carried trays of lobster appetizers and miniature desserts across the marble floor. It amazed me how humiliation could exist so quietly inside a beautiful room. I sat perfectly still at my table while Vanessa floated through the crowd like royalty. She smiled at everyone, touched arms gently while speaking, tilted her head back when she laughed. To strangers, she probably looked elegant and charming. That was Vanessa's greatest talent. She knew exactly how to appear warm while making someone else feel invisible. I watched her stop beside a group of women near the dance floor. One of them glanced toward me before whispering something into Vanessa's ear. The women laughed softly together. Vanessa covered her mouth dramatically like she was embarrassed by the joke, but I could see satisfaction in her eyes even from across the ballroom. She wanted people to notice the badge. She wanted them to laugh. More than that, she wanted me to know they were laughing. I lowered my eyes to the white linen tablecloth and folded my napkin again, even though it was already perfectly folded. My hands remained steady, but inside, old memories had started rising quietly to the surface one after another. Looking back now, I realized this night did not begin at Sophie's wedding. It began years ago. Tiny moments, small exclusions, little humiliations so subtle I convinced myself they were misunderstandings. The first time was Christmas 6 years earlier. Richard was still alive then. We drove nearly 4 hours through heavy snow to spend the holiday with Daniel and Vanessa at their home in Connecticut. I remember bringing homemade pecan pie and gifts carefully wrapped in silver paper for the grandchildren. When we arrived, Vanessa opened the front door with surprise written all over her face. "Oh," she said slowly. "I thought you were coming tomorrow." I still remember the silence that followed. Richard looked at me. I looked at him. We both knew I had repeated the correct date twice over the phone. But Vanessa smiled sweetly and blamed the confusion on holiday stress. We ended up spending Christmas Eve alone at a hotel off Interstate 95 while watching families walk through the snow outside our window. Richard held my hand that night and told me not to take it personally. "Families get busy," he said gently. He always believed the best about people, especially our son. Another memory surfaced while the string quartet shifted into a slower song near the dance floor. Sophie's high school graduation. Vanessa somehow forgot to save seats for Richard and me, even though we arrived early. We ended up sitting near the back of the football stadium under direct sunlight in 90-degree heat, while Vanessa's sister and her family occupied the front row. After the ceremony, Sophie barely had time to hug us before Vanessa pulled her away for photographs. "We already booked a private dinner downtown," she explained quickly. "It is just immediate family tonight." Immediate family. Richard smiled politely and said he understood. Later that evening, we ate cheeseburgers alone at a roadside diner while watching rain slide down the windows. Richard reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "At least we came," he said softly. I think about that sentence often now. At least we came. We always came. We always showed up. Birthdays, graduations, school plays, anniversary dinners. We were present for everything, even when our presence clearly became less welcome every year. After Richard passed away from heart failure 3 years ago, the distance between me and Daniel's family grew wider almost overnight. During the first 6 months after the funeral, Daniel only called twice. Both conversations lasted less than 10 minutes. Vanessa always seemed to answer his phone first whenever I called. Daniel is very busy right now, she would explain warmly. The children have so much going on. Sometimes I could hear laughter in the background while she spoke. Once I heard Sophie asking if Grandma was on the phone. Vanessa lowered her voice immediately after that. We will call you later, Eleanor. They rarely did. I kept making excuses for them because loneliness has a way of making you patient with people who hurt you, especially when they are family. The wedding planner suddenly appeared beside my table carrying a clipboard pressed against her chest. Mrs. Whitmore, she said nervously. I just wanted to make sure everything is meeting your expectations tonight. Expectations. I almost laughed at the word. Instead, I smiled politely. Everything looks beautiful, I told her honestly. And it did. That was the cruelest part. Every floral arrangement, every candle, every violin note drifting through the ballroom had been paid for with money Richard and I spent decades building together. I remembered the tiny apartment we lived in after Daniel was born. Richard worked 12-hour shifts at the steel company while attending night classes in accounting. I taught piano lessons from our living room to help pay bills. There were winters when we shared one car with a faulty heater because we could not afford another. We skipped vacations for years. Saved carefully. Invested carefully. Richard used to joke that I could stretch $1 farther than anyone in Illinois. Together, we built Whitmore Financial Consulting from a tiny office above a bakery into one of the most respected private firms in Chicago. Richard handled clients. I handled operations, payroll, scheduling, contracts, taxes. We built that company side by side. And now the fortune we created had somehow transformed me into a joke printed on cardstock at my own granddaughter's wedding. Across the ballroom, Daniel finally approached my table with a drink in his hand. His tuxedo jacket hung slightly open now and his tie had loosened around the collar. You doing okay, Mom? He asked distractedly while glancing toward the dance floor. I looked at my son carefully. At 52, he still had Richard's eyes. The same dark hair beginning to gray near the temples. For one painful second, I saw the little boy who used to run into my kitchen after baseball practice asking for grilled cheese sandwiches. The teenager who cried when his first girlfriend broke his heart. The young man who once promised he would always take care of me when I got older. I am fine, I answered quietly. Daniel nodded quickly as if relieved by my answer. Then his eyes dropped briefly to the badge pinned against my dress. For the smallest moment, his expression tightened with discomfort. Vanessa thought the tags would be funny, he muttered. Funny. I stared at him without speaking. He shifted uncomfortably beneath my silence. You know how she is, he added with a weak smile. Yes. I finally realized I did know exactly how she was. And what hurt most was realizing my son knew too. He simply chose convenience over courage. Daniel touched my shoulder awkwardly before walking back toward the bar, where Vanessa waited beside a cluster of guests. She slipped her arm through his immediately, smiling up at him while saying something that made him laugh. I watched them together beneath the ballroom lights while a strange calm slowly settled over me. For years, I kept trying to earn my place inside this family again. Tonight, I finally understood something important. They had already decided who I was to them long ago. Not a mother, not a grandmother, not even family, just the woman funding everything. The first dance ended beneath a shower of applause while Sophie rested, her head against her husband's shoulder. Guests smiled warmly around the dance floor as cameras flashed beneath the chandeliers. Anyone looking at that ballroom from the outside would have thought it was a perfect family celebration. That was the strange thing about wealthy families. Sometimes the prettier the room looked, the uglier the truth hiding inside it became. I remained seated near the edge of the ballroom, quietly watching everyone move around me like actors inside a play I no longer belonged to. My champagne glass sat untouched beside my plate. Across the table, 2 women from Daniel's social circle continued glancing down at the badge pinned to my dress before quickly looking away again. One of them finally leaned toward me with an awkward smile. I hope you know everyone appreciates what you have done for Sophie, she said softly. Appreciates. The words settled heavily in my chest, because appreciation was not what I felt in that room. Appreciation feels warm. Gratitude feels human. What I felt from my family was entitlement polished to look like affection. Before I could answer, someone quietly pulled out the chair beside me. I turned and found Ethan lowering himself into the seat with a nervous expression on his face. My grandson had always been different from the rest of the family. Softer somehow, more observant. At 24 years old, he still carried kindness in his eyes, which made him stand out in a room full of carefully practiced smiles. "Hey, Grandma," he said quietly. "You okay?" I studied him for a moment before nodding gently. "I am fine." Ethan glanced toward my badge and immediately looked uncomfortable. A faint red color crept into his cheeks. "I saw that earlier," he admitted softly. "I am really sorry." His voice sounded sincere enough to make my throat tighten unexpectedly. "You do not have to apologize for other people's behavior," I told him. Ethan lowered his eyes to the tablecloth. "Mom thought it was hilarious when the wedding planner showed her the design samples last week," he said after a long silence. "I told her she should not do it." Something inside me stilled completely. "Last week," I repeated quietly. Ethan nodded once. "She said it was just a joke." Dad laughed too. For several seconds, the music around us faded again into distant background noise. "Last week." That meant Vanessa planned the humiliation carefully. She approved it, discussed it, probably showed it to people before tonight, while everyone laughed together behind closed doors. My own son laughed too. I folded my hands neatly in my lap because suddenly I did not trust them not to shake. Ethan leaned closer to me, lowering his voice further. "Grandma, there is something else I think you should know." I looked at him calmly. "What is it?" He hesitated. "Mom has been telling people for months that you would keep paying for things because you are lonely." The words landed softly, but they cut deeper than anything Vanessa had said all evening. Lonely. As if love and grief had transformed me into someone weak enough to manipulate forever. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. "She tells people you would never stop helping because you are scared the family would disappear if you did." I stared across the ballroom toward Vanessa again. She stood near the cake table, now speaking animatedly with two older couples while resting one manicured hand against Daniel's arm. Every few seconds, she laughed brightly and touched someone's shoulder with practiced warmth. She looked polished, elegant, generous. Nobody in that room would have guessed she talked about me like that behind closed doors. Ethan rubbed his palms together nervously. "I should have told you sooner." "No," I said quietly. "You told me when you were ready." He nodded slowly, though guilt still lingered in his expression. I reached over and squeezed his hand gently. For the first time that evening, I felt something besides humiliation. I felt clarity, because Ethan's words explained years of confusion all at once. Every delayed phone call, every forgotten invitation, every subtle insult disguised as humor. Vanessa never feared losing me emotionally. She feared losing access to what I provided financially. I looked down at my wedding badge again. The old woman funding this entire wedding. Suddenly, it no longer felt cruel. It felt honest. Near the dance floor, the wedding coordinator tapped a microphone and announced dinner service. Guests slowly returned to their assigned tables, while waiters placed filet mignon and roasted vegetables in front of everyone. Conversations resumed immediately around the ballroom. I noticed Daniel laughing loudly with one of his business associates near the bar while Vanessa checked something on her phone. Neither of them looked toward me once. Ethan remained beside me quietly while guests around us began eating. "You know Grandpa would hate all this," he said suddenly. My chest tightened painfully at the mention of Richard. "Yes," I answered softly. "He would." Ethan smiled faintly. "He used to tell me stories about how you helped build the company with him." I looked down at my untouched dinner plate. Most people only remembered Richard as the face of Whitmore Financial Consulting. They forgot the years before the luxury offices and country club memberships. The years when Richard worked until midnight while I balanced payroll at our kitchen table beside stacks of unpaid invoices. They forgot I spent 2 decades handling operations while raising Daniel and keeping the company alive during recessions. Vanessa especially forgot. To her, the money simply existed like magic. An endless fountain she believed she deserved access to forever. "Your grandfather worked very hard," I said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "So did you." I looked at him then. Really looked at him. Sometimes kindness appears quietly in a family like a single candle burning inside a dark room. Ethan reminded me so much of Richard in that moment, it almost hurt to breathe. Before I could answer, another voice interrupted from behind us. Eleanor. I turned slowly and saw Martin Hale standing near the table adjusting the cuff of his dark gray suit jacket. Richard's attorney. Our attorney. Martin had handled our estate planning for over 25 years. His silver hair looked thinner than I remembered, but his sharp blue eyes remained exactly the same. Martin, I said with polite surprise. I did not realize you were invited. Daniel requested I attend, he answered carefully. Something about his tone immediately caught my attention. Ethan noticed it too because his posture stiffened slightly beside me. Martin glanced toward the ballroom entrance before lowering his voice. Would you mind if we spoke privately for a moment? A cold sensation moved quietly through my stomach. Of course, I replied. Martin offered me his arm politely, and together we stepped away from the crowded ballroom toward a quieter hallway near the hotel terrace. The music faded behind us as the glass doors closed softly. Outside, downtown Chicago glittered beneath the night sky, while cold wind swept across the terrace railings. Martin loosened his tie slightly before speaking again. Eleanor, I debated whether tonight was the right time to mention this. My heartbeat slowed strangely inside my chest. Mention what? Martin hesitated. In all the years I had known him, I had never seen him look uncertain before. There have been several recent requests involving the Whitmore family trust, he said carefully. Large requests. I frowned slightly. What kind of requests? Martin studied my face closely. Transfers. Withdrawals. Authorization changes. The wind moved softly through the terrace around us, while distant traffic glowed below the hotel windows. I assumed Daniel discussed them with you already, Martin continued quietly. But after seeing your reaction tonight, I am beginning to think perhaps he did not. For several seconds, I simply stared at Martin while cold wind swept across the hotel terrace behind us. The city lights below blurred softly against the dark glass buildings of downtown Chicago, but my attention remained fixed entirely on the man standing in front of me. What kind of authorization changes? I asked quietly. Martin slipped one hand into his coat pocket and exhaled slowly before answering. Over the past 18 months, Daniel submitted multiple requests involving the Whitmore trust accounts. Larger monthly distributions, expanded access permissions, liquidation approvals on several investment portfolios. His words landed one at a time like slow drops of ice water. I folded my arms gently across my chest, partly against the cold and partly to steady myself. And these requests were approved? Martin hesitated carefully. Some were. Some. He nodded once. The earlier requests matched existing discretionary clauses Richard established before his passing. Educational support, real estate assistance, family business expenses. I looked away briefly toward the glowing skyline. Richard always believed helping family financially would keep everyone connected. He trusted Daniel completely. So did I. Martin continued quietly. But more recently, several requests raised concerns inside the firm. My stomach tightened. What concerns? Martin glanced back toward the ballroom doors, as if making sure nobody could overhear us. The amounts increased significantly after Sophie's engagement was announced. I said nothing. Luxury expenditures, he continued carefully. Private travel, jewelry purchases, resort deposits, vendor transfers connected to the wedding. A bitter smile almost reached my lips. Of course. Suddenly, every detail around me felt painfully clear. The imported flowers, the champagne tower, the custom Italian marble dance floor Vanessa insisted on renting for the reception. I remembered Daniel mentioning casually during a phone call that wedding costs were becoming stressful. Vanessa apparently solved that problem by quietly reaching deeper into the trust Richard and I spent decades building. Daniel told me the trust documents had already been reviewed with you personally, Martin added. He claimed you preferred avoiding financial stress during retirement. I turned slowly back toward him. I never approved anything. Martin's expression darkened slightly, though not with surprise. More like confirmation. That is what I was afraid of. The cold evening air suddenly felt sharper against my skin. I pressed one hand lightly against the terrace railing beside me while trying to keep my breathing calm and even. Strange how betrayal changes shape once money enters the conversation. Emotional betrayal hurts the heart. Financial betrayal feels colder. More calculated. Less accidental. Why did nobody contact me directly? I asked after a long silence. Martin looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Because Daniel technically held secondary authorization access after Richard passed away. I closed my eyes briefly. Richard added Daniel to several oversight accounts after his own father developed dementia years ago. At the time, it seemed responsible, practical. We trusted our son completely. Martin lowered his voice further. But last month, there was another request involving principal withdrawals from the main family trust itself. My eyes opened immediately. The principal? Martin nodded grimly. A very large amount. I felt the blood drain slowly from my face. How large? He paused. $2.8 million. The city noise below seemed to disappear entirely after that. $2.8 million. Not assistance. Not family support. Not temporary help. That was extraction. I stared at Martin while old memories flickered rapidly through my mind. Vanessa insisting the wedding needed upgrades because Sophie deserved perfection. Daniel mentioning investment pressure during the economic downturn. Expensive vacations appearing suddenly on social media. Designer handbags. Renovation projects. Luxury ski trips in Aspen. All of it funded quietly beneath the surface while I sat alone inside a silent house, believing my family simply grew distant with time. Was the request approved? I finally whispered. Martin shook his head immediately. No. Our compliance department flagged the transaction pending direct verification from you. Relief moved through me so suddenly it almost weakened my knees. Martin continued before I could speak again. Daniel became angry after the delay. He insisted the transfer was urgent because several payments tied to the wedding and honeymoon had already been guaranteed. Wedding and honeymoon. The humiliation from earlier suddenly felt smaller compared to this. The badge was cruelty. This was strategy. Vanessa had not embarrassed me simply because she disliked me. She believed she already owned the money. She believed I existed solely to finance the lifestyle she wanted. The ballroom doors opened behind us briefly as two guests stepped outside, laughing softly before disappearing toward the elevators. Martin waited until they left before speaking again. Eleanor, I need to ask something directly. I looked at him calmly. Go ahead. Have you reviewed the trust statements yourself recently? The honest answer embarrassed me more than I expected. No, I admitted quietly. Richard always handled most of the financial reviews personally. After he died, I suppose I stopped paying close attention. Martin nodded sympathetically. That is understandable. But I suddenly realized it was not understandable at all. It was dangerous. Grief had made me passive. Loneliness had made me trusting. And Vanessa noticed both. I thought back to the months after Richard's funeral. The empty house. The untouched side of the bed. The mornings when I sat alone drinking coffee while staring out at the lake behind our property. During that period, Daniel and Vanessa began offering more help with family finances. Vanessa especially pushed gently for simplification. You should not stress yourself with paperwork anymore, Eleanor, she told me once while organizing kitchen cabinets during a visit. You deserve peace now. Peace. Such a beautiful word people use while quietly taking control away from you. Martin carefully removed a folded document from his briefcase and handed it to me. I brought copies tonight because something felt wrong. I unfolded the papers slowly beneath the terrace lights. Bank transfer requests. Authorization forms. Expense summaries. Vendor invoices. The numbers blurred together at first until one line caught my attention immediately. Fairmont Grand Hotel Ballroom Deposit. Paid from Whitmore Family Trust. Another line beneath it. Lake Como Villa Reservation. Paid from Whitmore Family Trust. My eyes moved lower down the page. Designer jewelry purchases. Luxury transportation services. Event production upgrades. Every single expense tied directly back to the accounts Richard created to protect future generations of our family, not fund someone's performance of wealth. I stared at Vanessa's signature near the bottom of several forms. Elegant cursive handwriting. Confident. Familiar. Suddenly, I remembered something Richard once told me years earlier after one particularly uncomfortable holiday dinner with Daniel and Vanessa. We were washing dishes together. Late at night, while everyone else slept upstairs. Richard dried a plate slowly before saying, Vanessa always measures people by usefulness. At the time, I defended her immediately. I said she was ambitious, organized, strong-willed. Richard simply nodded quietly and changed the subject. He saw it years before I did. There is something else, Martin said carefully. I looked up from the documents. What now? His expression turned serious. Earlier tonight, before the ceremony, Vanessa approached me privately near the ballroom entrance. My heartbeat slowed strangely again. Why? Martin adjusted his glasses before answering. She wanted reassurance the transfer delay would not become public during the wedding weekend. For a long moment, I simply stared at him while cold air swept across the terrace again. Not embarrassment. Not guilt. Her greatest concern was appearance. Maintaining the illusion. Keeping the luxury fantasy alive long enough for the photographs, the honeymoon, the social media posts. Behind the ballroom doors, applause suddenly erupted as guests cheered somewhere inside the reception hall. Probably cake cutting. Another carefully staged family moment funded entirely by the woman they mocked openly. I lowered my eyes toward the documents in my hands once more. The pages no longer made me feel shocked. They made me feel awake. Truly awake for the first time in years. Slowly, I folded the papers back together and handed them to Martin. Do not approve any additional transfers, I said calmly. Martin studied my face carefully. Understood. I looked through the ballroom glass doors where Vanessa stood posing for photographs beside Sophie and Daniel beneath hundreds of white roses. Everyone smiling. Everyone beautiful. Everyone comfortable spending money they assumed would always belong to them. Something cold settled quietly into place inside me then. Not rage. Not heartbreak. Something steadier. And Martin, I added softly, tomorrow morning, I want a complete review of every account connected to my family. When Martin and I stepped back into the ballroom, the reception had grown louder and warmer with alcohol and celebration. Guests crowded around the enormous wedding cake while cameras flashed across smiling faces. A jazz trio had replaced the string quartet, and soft golden light washed over the dance floor, where couples moved slowly beneath hanging roses and crystal chandeliers. Everything looked beautiful. Perfect, even. That was the danger of appearances. Some of the cruelest moments of my life happened in beautiful rooms. Vanessa spotted me immediately when I returned from the terrace. Her expression sharpened for only half a second before the performance returned. She glided toward me gracefully, champagne glass balanced in one hand, diamonds glittering at her ears. There you are, she said warmly enough for nearby guests to hear. We were wondering where you disappeared to. Her tone sounded affectionate, concerned. Anyone watching us would have believed she was a caring daughter-in-law checking on family. I looked at her calmly. Martin needed to discuss some paperwork. I watched her smile stiffen almost invisibly around the edges. Tiny reactions reveal the truth faster than words ever do. Tonight of all nights? She asked lightly while taking a sip of champagne. Surely business matters can wait until after the wedding weekend. There it was again. Not family. Not emotions. Timing. Control. I smiled politely. Apparently not. For the first time all evening, uncertainty flickered briefly behind Vanessa's eyes. Only for a second. Then it disappeared beneath another practiced smile. Well, she laughed softly, touching my arm for show. Let us not ruin Sophie's special night with financial stress. Financial stress. Such an interesting phrase coming from a woman wearing nearly $80,000 in jewelry funded by someone else's labor. I said nothing. Silence unsettles manipulative people far more than anger ever does. Vanessa waited another moment, probably expecting reassurance from me. When none came, she excused herself gracefully and returned toward the dance floor where Daniel stood speaking with several investors from his firm. I watched her lean close to him immediately, whispering. Daniel glanced toward me once while listening to her, then quickly looked away again. My son could never tolerate discomfort for very long. Even as a child, he avoided conflict like it physically pained him. When he was 12 years old, he accidentally broke a neighbor's mailbox with a baseball and spent 3 days pretending he knew nothing about it because he was terrified of disappointing people. Richard eventually walked him back to the house personally and made him apologize face to face. I remember Daniel crying afterward while Richard sat beside him on the porch swing. Being uncomfortable for 5 minutes is better than being dishonest forever, Richard told him gently. Somewhere over the years, Daniel forgot that lesson completely. Grandma. Ethan appeared beside me again carrying 2 untouched dessert plates. He handed me one carefully. Chocolate mousse. Your favorite. The simple kindness nearly broke something inside me after everything else that evening. Thank you, sweetheart. We sat quietly together while guests gathered near the center of the ballroom for speeches. Sophie looked radiant beneath the lights, her white gown spilling elegantly around her feet, while her new husband kept one arm wrapped around her waist protectively. She looked happy, truly happy. Watching her hurt more than I expected because I still loved her deeply despite everything. Love does not disappear simply because disappointment arrives. Sometimes they live side by side inside the same heart. The best man began speaking first, telling funny stories from college while guests laughed warmly around the room. Sophie wiped tears from her eyes during parts of the speech, while Daniel smiled proudly nearby. Vanessa rested one hand possessively against his chest the entire time, like she was claiming ownership over the family she had carefully reorganized around herself. Then came Daniel's turn. My son stepped toward the microphone while adjusting his tuxedo jacket nervously. "I just want to say how proud I am of Sophie tonight," he began. His voice echoed softly across the ballroom speakers. "Your mother and I could not be happier for you." Ethan shifted slightly beside me. I remained perfectly still. Daniel continued speaking about family traditions, love, loyalty, and sacrifice while guests nodded approvingly. Listening to him felt almost surreal after everything Martin revealed on the terrace. "Family is about showing up for one another," Daniel said warmly. "Supporting each other through every season of life." I lowered my eyes slowly toward my folded napkin because suddenly I could not bear looking directly at him anymore. The hypocrisy exhausted me more than the cruelty itself. After several more sentimental remarks, Daniel lifted his champagne glass toward Sophie. "And of course," he added with a broad smile, "none of tonight would have been possible without the incredible generosity of family." Guests applauded politely. Several heads turned toward me automatically. I felt dozens of eyes settle briefly onto the badge still pinned against my dress. Vanessa smiled sweetly in my direction while raising her own glass. The humiliation was no longer subtle now. It had become part of the entertainment. Ethan muttered something under his breath beside me that sounded suspiciously close to anger. I touched his sleeve gently before he could speak further. "Do not," I whispered softly. "Not tonight." He looked at me helplessly. "How are you still so calm?" I considered the question honestly for a moment. Calm was not the right word anymore. I was simply finished pretending not to see what stood directly in front of me. The speeches ended. Music resumed. Guests drifted back toward dancing and drinking while servers circulated with coffee and expensive desserts. Across the ballroom, Vanessa laughed loudly beside a cluster of women while occasionally glancing toward me like she was checking whether her performance had landed successfully. It had, but not in the way she imagined. Because something fundamental inside me had shifted permanently during the past 2 hours. For years I approached my family from a place of fear. Fear of loneliness. Fear of becoming unnecessary. Fear that saying no would push everyone further away. Vanessa sensed that fear immediately after Richard died. She learned exactly how far she could stretch my silence before it snapped. The answer, apparently, was very far. But people make dangerous mistakes when they confuse kindness with weakness. My phone vibrated softly inside my evening bag. I opened it discreetly beneath the table and saw a message from Martin. "Please check your email privately before morning." I included copies of all pending transfer requests. I stared at the message for several seconds before locking the screen again. Pending transfer requests. Suddenly I realized something else. Vanessa and Daniel assumed they still had time. Time before I noticed. Time before I questioned anything. Time before the trust money officially became inaccessible to them. That assumption was about to become their biggest mistake. "Mrs. Whitmore?" I looked up to find the wedding photographer standing beside the table holding his camera. The bride would love a 3-generation portrait before the evening ends. 3 generations. Such a beautiful phrase for people who barely functioned like a family anymore. Still, I stood carefully and followed him toward the floral backdrop near the ballroom staircase. Sophie smiled brightly when she saw me approaching. "Grandma, you look beautiful tonight," she said sincerely before kissing my cheek. The sweetness in her voice almost made me forget everything else for a moment. Almost. Vanessa immediately stepped beside us, placing herself between Daniel and Sophie with practiced perfection. The photographer adjusted his lens while arranging everyone beneath the flowers. "Okay," he called cheerfully. "Everybody closer together." Vanessa slipped one arm around my waist lightly. For the camera. Her perfume smelled expensive and sharp. "Smile, Eleanor," she whispered softly enough that only I could hear. "This is family." I turned my head slightly toward her. For years, comments like that would have wounded me deeply. Tonight, they simply sounded hollow. Because families built entirely around money eventually reveal themselves the moment the money stops flowing. The photographer lifted his camera. Flashbulbs burst brightly across the ballroom. Sophie smiled happily between us, while Vanessa maintained her flawless expression beside me. Looking at the scene from a distance, nobody would have guessed the woman standing next to me had spent months quietly draining millions from the trust my husband and I created. Nobody would have guessed she viewed me less like a grandmother and more like a financial resource that needed careful management. But I knew now. And once truth finally settles into your bones, it becomes impossible to unsee it. The photographer lowered his camera with satisfaction. Perfect, he announced proudly. I smiled politely at him before turning toward Vanessa one last time. Then, for the first time all evening, I noticed something unexpected hidden beneath her confidence. Fear. The reception finally began slowing down close to midnight. Older guests drifted toward the elevators while younger ones gathered near the ballroom bar, laughing over cocktails and wedding stories. Outside the tall hotel windows, Chicago shimmered beneath the cold spring sky, all silver lights and quiet movement. I stood near the edge of the ballroom, watching servers clear empty champagne glasses from the tables, while soft jazz music floated through the room like smoke. Everything looked calmer now, softer. But underneath that polished surface, I could feel tension quietly shifting direction. Vanessa watched me constantly after the family photographs. She tried not to make it obvious, but every few minutes her eyes found me across the ballroom. Fear changes people in subtle ways. It sharpens their smiles too much, makes their laughter arrive a second too late. I recognized it immediately because I spent years afraid myself. Afraid of loneliness. Afraid of being abandoned after Richard died. Afraid that if I stopped saying yes, my family would stop needing me altogether. But standing there beneath those chandeliers, I realized something important. People who truly love you do not disappear simply because money does. Vanessa knew that too, which was exactly why she looked nervous now. You are quiet tonight. I turned and found Sophie beside me holding the bottom of her wedding gown carefully off the floor. Up close, she looked exhausted but happy in the way only newly married people can look. Her cheeks were flushed from dancing and champagne. A loose curl had fallen beside her face. For a moment, she looked exactly like the little girl who used to sit beside me in my kitchen making Christmas cookies while Richard pretended to steal frosting from the bowl. My chest tightened painfully at the memory. Long evening, I answered gently. Sophie smiled softly. Thank you for everything, Grandma. Really. I studied her face carefully. There was sincerity there. Real affection. That made what came next even harder. Did you know about the badge? I asked quietly. Sophie blinked in confusion. What badge? I touched the white card still pinned against my dress. Her eyes moved downward immediately. The moment she read it, all color drained slowly from her face. Oh my God, she whispered. Grandma. She looked genuinely horrified. I did not see this before. I believed her instantly. Sophie might have inherited Vanessa's beauty, but she had not inherited her cruelty. Not completely. Mom told me the guest cards were just themed jokes for family tables, she said quickly. I swear I did not know. Her voice trembled now with embarrassment and guilt. I reached over and touched her hand lightly. I know. Sophie looked close to tears suddenly. I am so sorry. I could have comforted her then. Could have told her none of it mattered. That everything was fine. For most of my life, that is exactly what I would have done. Protected everyone else from consequences while swallowing my own pain quietly. But protecting people from consequences is often the same thing as teaching them nothing. Your mother has made a great many decisions lately without considering how they affect other people, I said calmly. Sophie lowered her eyes immediately because somewhere deep down, she already knew that was true. She just gets carried away sometimes, she whispered weakly. I almost smiled at that because I used to say the exact same thing about Vanessa years ago. Carried away. Strong personality. High standards. Ambitious. Amazing how long intelligent women can spend translating cruelty into softer language just to keep peace inside a family. Enjoy the rest of your evening, sweetheart. I told her gently. Tonight should still belong to you. Sophie hugged me tightly then. For a brief moment, I held my granddaughter close and wondered whether she would eventually become more like Richard or more like Vanessa once enough years passed. Families are strange that way. You never truly know which qualities survive into the next generation until life tests them. After she walked away, my phone vibrated quietly inside my evening bag again. Another message from Martin. Compliance Department confirmed attempted access requests were submitted again this evening from Daniel's account. I stared at the screen while a strange calm spread through me. Tonight, during the wedding itself, while smiling for photographs and giving speeches about family loyalty, Daniel was still trying to move trust money behind the scenes. I slipped the phone back into my bag slowly. Then I looked across the ballroom toward my son. He stood near the bar with two business associates, laughing casually while one arm rested across the back of a chair. Vanessa stood beside him scrolling through her phone with visible irritation now, probably checking emails, waiting for updates, waiting for money she already considered hers. The realization no longer hurt the way it had earlier. Instead, it clarified everything. Richard used to say that financial behavior reveals character faster than conversation ever will. Watch how people act around resources, he told me once after a difficult negotiation decades ago. Scarcity shows fear. Access shows values. Daniel and Vanessa had access to nearly everything they wanted already. Yet somehow it was never enough. Ethan appeared beside me again, carrying our coats over one arm. You heading out soon? He asked softly. I nodded once. I think so. He glanced across the ballroom toward his parents before lowering his voice. Grandma, if something bad is happening financially, you do not have to protect them. His words surprised me enough that I looked at him carefully. Why would you say that? Ethan hesitated. Because everyone in this family always protects Mom from consequences. Dad especially. He was right. Daniel spent years smoothing over Vanessa's behavior because confrontation exhausted him. Eventually, the entire family adapted around her, like furniture rearranged around a crack in the wall nobody wanted to repair. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Honestly, I think Mom believes the trust already belongs to us. Us, not you. Not family stewardship. Ownership. I thought back to the terrace conversation with Martin. The repeated transfer attempts. The growing withdrawals. The urgency surrounding wedding expenses. Somewhere along the line, Daniel and Vanessa stopped viewing the trust as something entrusted to future generations carefully. They started viewing it as an unlimited lifestyle account waiting to be unlocked permanently once I became passive enough. Or gone enough. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as staff prepared for the final dances of the evening. Guests gathered near the center of the room, while Sophie and her husband returned to the floor together beneath soft amber lighting. Around them, people smiled and swayed gently to slow music while cameras flashed one last time. It should have felt beautiful. Instead, the entire room suddenly reminded me of a stage set built over unstable ground. Gorgeous from a distance, fragile underneath. I slipped my coat carefully over my shoulders while Ethan helped me gather my purse and gloves. Across the ballroom, Vanessa noticed immediately. Her posture straightened. She whispered something urgently into Daniel's ear before both of them started walking toward me together. Interesting. They were worried about me leaving now. Earlier in the evening, they barely noticed whether I existed. You are leaving already? Vanessa asked brightly once they reached me. Too brightly. Daniel smiled awkwardly beside her. Mom, we barely spent any time together tonight. I looked at both of them calmly. The son I raised. The woman he chose. Two people standing beneath crystal chandeliers financed by trust accounts they quietly tried to empty behind my back. It has been a very long evening, I answered politely. Vanessa touched my arm lightly again. Well, do not worry about anything tonight, Eleanor. Everything worked out beautifully in the end. Her eyes searched my face carefully while she spoke, almost like she was testing whether I knew more than she expected. I held her gaze without blinking. Not quite everything, I said softly. For the first time all evening, Daniel looked genuinely uneasy. Vanessa's smile froze for half a second before recovering again. Tiny reactions. Tiny cracks. But once cracks appear, they rarely stop spreading. I adjusted my gloves slowly before looking toward Daniel one last time. I think tomorrow morning we should finally have a proper conversation about the family trust. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. But inside those few seconds, I watched both. Their expressions changed completely. The silence after my words lasted only a moment, but it felt long enough for every hidden truth in that ballroom to finally rise to the surface. Daniel blinked first. Vanessa recovered second. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Tomorrow, Daniel repeated with a strained smile. Mom, maybe this is not really the time for financial discussions. His voice carried the same nervous tone he used as a teenager whenever he wanted difficult conversations to disappear on their own. Vanessa stepped in smoothly before I could answer. Exactly, she said lightly while tightening her grip on Daniel's arm. Tonight should stay positive. Everybody is emotional and exhausted. Emotional. Exhausted. Interesting how quickly people start using softer language when control begins slipping away from them. I adjusted my gloves calmly. I agree, I said, which is why tomorrow morning seems appropriate. Vanessa's smile held, but barely now. Well, she laughed softly. I am sure whatever misunderstanding exists can be cleared up quickly. Misunderstanding. Another useful word people choose when they are trying to minimize intentional behavior. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Mom, maybe Martin confused something about the trust structure. There are a lot of moving pieces financially. I looked directly at my son then. Really looked at him. His eyes would not hold mine for more than a second at a time. Richard used to say guilt makes people physically restless long before it makes them honest. I am sure there are, I answered quietly. Vanessa stepped slightly closer to me. Eleanor, nobody has done anything inappropriate here. That sentence almost made me smile because innocent people rarely speak in defensive absolutes before accusations are even made. Good, I replied calmly. Then tomorrow should be very simple. The ballroom suddenly felt much quieter around us, even though music still played softly near the dance floor. I could sense both of them recalculating in real time, trying to determine exactly how much I knew, trying to estimate whether Martin already revealed specific numbers, trying to decide which version of the truth would protect them best. Vanessa recovered first, of course. She always did. You should get some rest tonight, she said warmly. We can all sit down together after brunch tomorrow. I nodded once. Noon. At my house. Daniel hesitated. Your house? Yes, I answered softly. The one still legally owned. By me. For the first time all evening, Vanessa's expression cracked openly. Only for a second, but I saw it clearly, and she knew I saw it. I smiled politely, then turned toward Ethan. Would you walk me downstairs, sweetheart? Ethan immediately stepped forward. Of course. Neither Daniel nor Vanessa tried stopping us this time. They simply stood there watching while I walked away across the ballroom floor beneath hanging roses and crystal lights. Guests continued dancing nearby, completely unaware that the foundation beneath one wealthy family had already begun quietly collapsing. As Ethan and I stepped into the hotel elevator, the silence between us felt strangely peaceful after the tension upstairs. The mirrored walls reflected both our faces side by side, my silver hair carefully pinned in place. His tired eyes watching me with concern. Are you okay? He asked once the doors closed. I considered the question honestly. No, I admitted softly. But I think I finally will be. Ethan leaned against the elevator railing quietly. Dad sounded scared. He should be. The answer surprised both of us slightly because I almost never spoke that directly. But the truth had become exhausting to soften anymore. The elevator doors opened into the marble lobby where late-night guests moved quietly beneath enormous chandeliers. Outside, cold air rushed through the revolving doors each time someone entered from the street. Ethan walked me toward the valet station while city traffic hummed softly beyond the glass windows. Grandma, he said carefully, if Mom and Dad really did misuse the trust, what happens now? I stopped beside the hotel entrance before answering. For years, I would have responded emotionally to a question like that. With guilt, fear, worry about damaging the family. But standing there in the cold Chicago night, something inside me felt startlingly clear instead. Now, I said quietly, the truth finally matters more than appearances. Ethan looked at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. Grandpa would be proud of you tonight. The words hit me harder than I expected. Richard. Suddenly I could picture him so clearly. Sitting at our kitchen table early in the morning reading financial reports beside black coffee and half-finished toast. Calm, steady, impossible to manipulate because he always paid attention to details. Grief blinded me after his death in ways I still barely understood. I stopped reviewing statements carefully, stopped questioning withdrawals, stopped protecting boundaries because loneliness made conflict feel unbearable. Vanessa noticed that weakness immediately. and she built an entire system around it. The valet pulled my car around beneath the hotel lights while Ethan helped me with my coat collar against the wind. Before I got inside the car, he touched my arm gently. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "I am on your side." I looked at my grandson and felt something warm break through the coldness settling inside me all evening. Not everyone in this family had lost themselves completely. "Thank you," I whispered. Then I drove home alone through sleeping Chicago streets while wedding music and crystal chandeliers replayed endlessly inside my mind. Downtown skyscrapers glowed against the dark sky while headlights streaked across wet pavement from an earlier rain. Everything outside looked calm and ordinary. But inside me, years of denial were rearranging themselves into something sharper, clearer. When I finally pulled into the driveway of my lakefront home just after 1 a.m, the house stood dark and silent beneath the trees. Richard planted those trees himself nearly 20 years ago. Maple, oak, birch. He always said a home should feel rooted before it feels impressive. I sat inside the parked car for several minutes before going in. The silence no longer felt lonely tonight. It felt observant somehow, like the house itself had been waiting for me to finally wake up. Inside, I slipped off my heels near the foyer and walked slowly through the dark living room. Moonlight reflected softly across hardwood floors and framed family photographs lining the shelves. Daniel as a little boy holding a fishing rod beside Richard at Lake Michigan. Sophie smiling in her kindergarten uniform. Christmas mornings. Birthday dinners. Vacations in Maine. Decades of memories staring back at me from silver frames. I used to look at those photographs and feel gratitude. Tonight, I noticed something different instead. In nearly every picture from the last 10 years, Vanessa stood at the center while everyone else arranged themselves around her. Slowly, subtly, like ivy wrapping around a house until nobody notices the original structure underneath anymore. I removed the badge from my dress carefully once I reached the kitchen. The old woman funding this entire wedding. I placed the card flat on the marble counter beneath the overhead lights and stared at it quietly. Earlier that evening it humiliated me. Now it felt almost symbolic. An accidental confession printed in gold script. I opened the refrigerator and poured myself a glass of water before checking my phone again. 3 missed calls from Daniel already. 2 text messages from Vanessa. "I think tensions are high tonight. Please do not let Martin create unnecessary problems for the family." The family. Again. Always the family whenever consequences approached. I locked the phone without answering either message. Then I walked upstairs toward Richard's old study for the first time in months. The room still smelled faintly like leather and cedarwood. Financial files remained organized neatly along the shelves exactly the way he left them. I sat slowly behind his desk, while moonlight filtered through the windows overlooking the lake. For years after Richard died, entering this room hurt too much. Tonight, it felt necessary. I opened my laptop, logged into the trust accounts personally, and within 10 minutes, I realized the truth was even worse than Martin understood. The glow from the computer screen illuminated Richard's study in soft blue light, while the rest of the house remained silent around me. Outside the windows, Lake Michigan stretched dark and endless beneath the early morning sky. I sat alone at Richard's desk wearing the same pale blue dress from the wedding. Except now the fabric felt heavier somehow. Maybe humiliation has weight after all. The trust account dashboard remained open in front of me, while lines of transactions filled the screen one after another. At first, I thought exhaustion might be distorting what I was seeing. So I put on my reading glasses. Then I started over from the beginning. The numbers did not change. Over the past 2.5 years, Daniel and Vanessa had quietly withdrawn nearly $1.9 million from various family trust accounts. Not all at once. That would have been obvious. No, they moved carefully. Small enough amounts to avoid attention during periods when I was grieving and distracted. 20,000 here, 45,000 there. Luxury travel reimbursements labeled as family development retreats. Property maintenance requests connected to vacation homes I had never visited. Educational support allocations that somehow paid for private wine tours through Napa Valley and first-class flights to St. Bart's. Every page I opened revealed another layer beneath the one before it. The worst part was not the amount. Richard and I built enough wealth that even those numbers would not destroy the trust itself. No, the worst part was the strategy, the patience, the quiet confidence behind it. They never intended to ask permission honestly, because they already convinced themselves the money belonged to them eventually anyway. I leaned back slowly in Richard's leather chair while one memory surfaced suddenly from years earlier. Vanessa is standing inside my kitchen after Richard's funeral, helping organize sympathy flowers while speaking softly about how difficult finances become for adult children caring for aging parents. At the time, her concerns sounded thoughtful. Now I realized she had been studying vulnerabilities even then. Grief makes people easier to guide, easier to influence, easier to isolate from details. My eyes drifted toward the bookshelf beside the desk where Richard kept framed photographs from different stages of our life together. One picture showed us standing outside our first office downtown. I was 29 years old. Richard was 32. Neither of us had enough money for proper furniture yet, so we bought secondhand desks from a bankrupt insurance company and painted them ourselves over an entire weekend. I remember eating cheap takeout on the office floor surrounded by paperwork, while Richard promised me one day all the sacrifice would mean something for our family. Family. The word sounded almost foreign tonight. I opened another file on the computer. This one contained pending transfer requests submitted during the past 6 weeks alone. Honeymoon villa upgrades in Italy. Luxury vehicle rentals. Jewelry invoices from Cartier. Event production expenses tied directly to the wedding reception. Total requested amount pending approval. $2,800,000. My hands finally trembled then. Not from fear anymore. From realization. Vanessa never expected resistance because she believed my loneliness guaranteed compliance. And honestly, until tonight, she probably would have been right. I closed my eyes briefly and remembered the badge pinned against my dress. The old woman funding this entire wedding. Such a careless little joke. Vanessa thought humiliation would make me smaller, easier to control. Instead, it forced me awake. My phone buzzed softly against the desk. Daniel again. Fourth missed call since midnight. Another text appeared immediately after. Mom, please answer. We need to talk before things get blown out of proportion. I stared at the message for several seconds. Blown out of proportion. Interesting phrase for someone quietly draining family trusts behind his mother's back. A second message appeared almost immediately. This one from Vanessa. I think everybody misunderstood some financial planning decisions. We can clear everything up calmly tomorrow. Calmly. Another useful word people choose when they are afraid consequences are approaching faster than expected. I placed the phone face down on the desk without responding. Then I opened the final folder Martin emailed earlier that evening. Internal compliance notes from the firm. Detailed timelines. Authorization records. Communication summaries. One particular note made my stomach turn cold. Client representatives Daniel and Vanessa Whitmore expressed concern primary beneficiary Eleanor Whitmore may become emotionally unstable if financial restrictions increase due to widowhood adjustment. I read the sentence 3 times slowly. Emotionally unstable. Widowhood adjustment. Carefully chosen professional language designed to frame me as fragile and irrational if questions ever arose later. Vanessa had been preparing narratives, not just withdrawals. I suddenly remembered another conversation from last Thanksgiving. Daniel insisted I should consider downsizing the house because maintaining large properties alone at your age can become overwhelming. At the time, I thought he sounded worried about me. Now I realized he sounded strategic. Slowly, I removed my reading glasses and rubbed my eyes. The sky outside had begun lightening faintly near the horizon. I had spent nearly 4 hours inside Richard's study without noticing time passing. Funny how clarity arrives. Not dramatically, quietly, like fog lifting from water one slow inch at a time. By 6:30 in the morning, I had printed every financial document Martin sent me. Transfer records, withdrawal histories, vendor invoices, compliance warnings. I organized them neatly across Richard's desk while fresh coffee brewed downstairs in the kitchen. The evidence looked strangely clinical spread across polished wood surfaces. Numbers, dates, signatures, years of manipulation reduced to paperwork. Yet behind every page lived moments I suddenly understood differently now. Sophie's lavish engagement party in the Hamptons. The spontaneous ski vacation in Aspen Vanessa posted endlessly online. Daniel's expensive renovation project last summer. The new Porsche sitting in their driveway 3 months after Daniel complained business cash flow felt tight. All of it connected quietly back to accounts they assumed I would never examine personally again. I carried my coffee upstairs and sat beside the windows overlooking the lake while dawn slowly brightened the water outside. Exhaustion pressed heavily against my body now, but emotionally I felt strangely steady. Grief had ruled me since Richard died. Loneliness ruled me after that. Tonight something else replaced both. Perspective. At exactly 7:12 in the morning, the house phone rang sharply downstairs. I already knew who it was before answering. Mom. Daniel's voice sounded strained immediately. Thank God. I remained silent long enough for discomfort to settle between us. I think we need to clear up some confusion before Martin creates unnecessary panic. He continued quickly. There it was again. Confusion. Panic. As if the real problem here was emotional overreaction instead of systematic financial deception. I reviewed the accounts myself last night, I said calmly. Silence answered me instantly. Then a quiet exhale. Mom. No, I interrupted softly. You do not get to call me emotional before speaking honestly. Another silence. Longer this time. Vanessa handled a lot of the trust logistics, Daniel admitted carefully. Some decisions may have moved too quickly because of the wedding pressure. I almost laughed then. Amazing how people shrink wrongdoing into administrative inconvenience once they realize evidence exists. $2 million is not moving too quickly, Daniel. His breathing changed slightly over the line. Mom, please lower your voice. Lower my voice. Inside my own home. About money Richard and I spent 40 years earning. Something cold settled deeper into place inside me then. You and Vanessa will arrive here at noon, I said quietly. Bring every financial record connected to the wedding expenses and all trust withdrawals made since your father died. Daniel swallowed audibly. That seems extreme. No, I answered softly. Extreme was humiliating your widowed mother publicly while attempting to empty family trusts behind her back. The silence afterward felt different now. Not defensive. Frightened. Mom, Daniel whispered, please do not destroy the family over this. I looked out across the lake while morning sunlight finally touched the water. For years that sentence would have broken me completely because protecting the family mattered more to me than almost anything else. But protecting something rotten only allows the damage to spread further. I am not the one destroying this family, I replied calmly. Then I hung up the phone. A few seconds later, another message appeared from Vanessa. We should all be careful before making accusations we cannot take back. I stared at the screen quietly before setting the phone aside once more. Then I rose from Richard's desk, walked to the closet near the study doorway, and removed the small fireproof lockbox Richard always kept hidden on the top shelf. Inside sat the original trust documents, property deeds, secondary authorization clauses, emergency override provisions. Richard created them years ago for worst-case scenarios involving fraud or coercion against the primary beneficiary. Against me. Slowly, I opened the folder containing the override forms and began reading every single page. By 11:30 that morning, the entire house smelled faintly like coffee and rain. Gray clouds had rolled over the lake during the early hours, turning the water outside my windows dark and restless. I stood alone in the kitchen arranging financial documents into neat folders while soft jazz played quietly from the speaker Richard installed years ago near the breakfast nook. The calmness of the room felt almost unnatural compared to the storm building beneath it. On the marble counter sat 3 separate stacks of paperwork. Trust withdrawals, pending transfer requests, compliance reports from Martin's office. Every number highlighted carefully in yellow. Every unauthorized signature marked with notes in my own handwriting. I had not slept at all, but strangely, exhaustion no longer mattered. Clarity gives energy, grief cannot. At exactly 11:47, I heard tires rolling slowly across the driveway outside. I looked through the kitchen windows and saw Daniel's black SUV pulling toward the front entrance. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat wearing oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. Even from a distance, I could see tension in the way she held herself. Sharp shoulders, tight jaw. Daniel parked near the front steps, but neither of them got out immediately. They stayed inside the vehicle talking for nearly a full minute before finally stepping into the cold morning air together. Interesting. They were preparing strategy before walking inside my house. The same house Richard and I paid off 31 years ago. The same house where Daniel learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway. Funny how quickly people start treating family homes like negotiation spaces once money becomes involved. I opened the front door before they could ring the bell. You are early, I said calmly. Vanessa smiled first. Of course she did. We did not want things to feel confrontational, she answered smoothly while removing her sunglasses. We are family. Family again. The word had become almost meaningless coming from her mouth. Daniel stepped forward awkwardly and kissed my cheek lightly. His skin felt cold from outside. Mom. His voice sounded strained and exhausted. Good. Mine should not have been the only sleepless night after that wedding. I stepped aside silently and allowed them into the foyer. Vanessa glanced around the house immediately while removing her coat. I noticed her eyes linger briefly on the staircase leading toward Richard's study upstairs. Calculating. Wondering how much I had already reviewed. Wondering what documents still existed. Daniel walked toward the living room slowly while rubbing his hands together nervously. This whole situation got out of hand really fast, he muttered. I said nothing. Silence remained more powerful than arguments now. We sat around the large dining table overlooking the lake, where Richard hosted hundreds of family dinners over the years. Thanksgiving meals, Christmas breakfasts, birthday celebrations. So many memories attached to that table. Yet this morning it felt less like a family space and more like a boardroom before hostile negotiations began. Vanessa folded her hands neatly in front of her. Perfect posture. Perfect makeup despite almost no sleep. Eleanor, she began softly, before this conversation becomes unnecessarily emotional, I think we should remember that every financial decision we made was intended to benefit the family long-term. Intended. Benefit. Long-term. Carefully polished language already prepared in advance. I opened the first folder calmly. You withdrew $120,000 from educational allocation funds for a luxury resort in Aspen. Vanessa did not blink. That trip involved networking opportunities connected to Daniel's firm. I slid another document across the table. You charged $38,000 in jewelry purchases under household maintenance reimbursements. Daniel shifted visibly beside her. Vanessa remained composed. Certain expenses were categorized incorrectly by accounting assistants. I looked directly at my son. And the $2.8 million transfer request submitted during Sophie's wedding weekend? Daniel exhaled slowly before speaking. Mom, we were under pressure financially because the wedding budget expanded unexpectedly. I stared at him in disbelief. So your solution was secretly emptying family trusts? That is not fair. Vanessa interrupted sharply for the first time. We never intended to hide anything permanently. Permanently. Another revealing word choice. As if temporary betrayal somehow felt more acceptable. I leaned back slowly in my chair while rain tapped softly against the lakefront windows behind us. Tell me something honestly, I said quietly. At what point did you both decide my role in this family was simply financing your lifestyle? Neither of them answered immediately. That silence told me more than any explanation ever could. Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. Mom, you are twisting this into something personal. I almost laughed at that. Personal. They publicly humiliated me at a wedding financed with my own money while secretly attempting million-dollar withdrawals behind my back. What exactly did he believe made that impersonal? Vanessa leaned forward slightly. Nobody was trying to hurt you. I reached into my purse calmly and placed the wedding badge onto the center of the dining table between us. The old woman funding this entire wedding. The room went completely silent. Vanessa looked away first this time. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, like someone already overwhelmed by consequences arriving faster than expected. That was supposed to be a joke, he muttered weakly. No, I answered softly. It was honesty disguised as humor. Rain continued falling outside while the three of us sat around that table surrounded by decades of family photographs hanging on nearby walls. The irony felt almost unbearable. Pictures of birthdays, vacations, smiling holidays. Evidence of a family that once loved each other honestly before entitlement hollowed everything out from the inside. Vanessa crossed her arms now, defensive composure finally replacing polished charm. I think you are forgetting how much support we have provided you these past few years. I looked at her carefully. Support. Daniel handled financial responsibilities while you were grieving. She continued quickly. We checked on you constantly after Richard passed away. Checked on me. Interesting way to describe monitoring access to trust accounts. You isolated me, I said quietly. You convinced me I was too overwhelmed to review my own finances. You used grief as leverage. Daniel sat forward immediately. Mom, that is not true. I held his gaze steadily. Then why did your wife describe me as emotionally unstable to compliance officers? Both their expressions changed instantly. There it was. Real fear this time. Vanessa recovered first, but slower now. That language was taken out of context. Really? I slid Martin's printed report across the table toward them. Highlighted sections. Dates. Internal notes. Every carefully documented attempt to frame me as fragile enough to lose authority over my own wealth. Daniel scanned the pages while color slowly drained from his face. Jesus Christ, he whispered under his breath. Vanessa grabbed the documents quickly from his hands. This is ridiculous, she snapped. Martin has always disliked me. I almost smiled at the desperation creeping into her voice now. This is not about Martin. I folded my hands neatly on the table. This is about two people who mistook my grief for weakness. Vanessa stood abruptly from her chair. Fine, she said coldly. You want honesty? Yes. We assumed the trust would eventually become ours anyway. Richard would have wanted the family taken care of. The family, I repeated softly. Or your lifestyle? Daniel stood immediately too. Vanessa, sit down. But she was already unraveling now. Do you know how expensive maintaining appearances becomes in our social circle? She demanded angrily. Do you know what people expect from us? I stared at her in complete silence while realization settled fully into place inside me. She truly believed this. The vacations, the jewelry, the luxury weddings, the private clubs. None of it felt excessive to her because she viewed my wealth as inherited entitlement already waiting for transfer. The room suddenly felt very still despite the storm outside. Daniel looked trapped between panic and shame. Vanessa looked furious. And for the first time since Richard died, I no longer felt emotionally smaller than either of them. I reached calmly for the final folder resting beside my coffee cup. Then I slid it slowly across the table toward them. Daniel frowned. What is this? I met my son's eyes steadily. Emergency override documents signed by your father 11 years ago. Vanessa's face changed immediately. What does that mean? I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. It means as of 8 o'clock this morning, every trust account connected to either of you has been frozen indefinitely.